You are listening to Something Rather Than Nothing. Creator and host, Ken Vellante. Editor and producer, Peter Bauer.
I used to work in museums, so I think a lot about this. It was contemporary art museums, so there's a lot of question about, I was in charge of one exhibition where we had to put a burrito on a windowsill every day, and that was art. So I have a lot of thoughts and have had a lot of conversations about.
Was the burrito good?
It was not for eating. Although, so I worked in visitor services and programming, so I was kind of the outward facing. So, the curators had us in charge of placing the burrito every morning before we opened the museum, and replacing it if someone took the burrito.
Yeah.
So often we would have to be like, okay, here's $10. Like,
You've destroyed the artwork. You've destroyed the artwork. Thank you.
It's not for eating. And of course, the artist was like, you have to get the burrito from this place, a whole thing. And that's the question, right, of contemporary art, of, found art often. It's like, how is it being displayed? And just by being displayed in a museum, it becomes art and not a burrito. Like that, I guess I buy into that in a way. If we are thinking about it as something that's being on display and being presented as art. But I think that goes back to my connection to it, which is really like it's communicating with another person. So the minute that it leaves, my computer, the minute that it leaves a studio space and gets offered up to the public, then it has the potential to work on the level of art, I guess.
Yeah. I asked, it's such a fun question, and I think the burrito example, it's always like provocative, and I've talked about Andy Warhol's Brillo box, which I think is a fantastic sculpture, and I'm still grappling with why I think that, or why I'm so attracted to that, and with different forms of art, with regards to poetry. Like I said, I had studied it. And one way I had studied it initially, which really threw me off, is I took an Old English, Middle English poetry college course. And the professor was like, I don't give a shit what the words are. It was sound. It was like sound. It was all, everything was sound.
Right.
And, obviously you can read it and, what's the story? I want my head to go with that. But it's such a radical step I took into that. And then just hearing the sounds and where that poetry was. And I thought that's just so fascinating because enjoying spoken word in that immediacy of voice. I mean, the world seems like super complicated and apps and technology advancing. But at its core, spoken word feels like that same voice, speaking out, and has that immediacy to it. Regarding like the content of your work, what I find so inviting about it is that if it feels comfortable to me in the sense of like entering like culture and like American culture and hearing the Black experience, and within that, it's hip in a way where like I can be entertained by your like musical references, like and really get into that. I wanted to ask you, within like, I don't know, the poetry circuit and such, is there this view, like when you bring in popular culture, and thinking about, the kind of snootiness of poetry, is there a battle that you end up in as far as, referring to culture and talking about Venus Williams and Beyonce, where it's kind of like people giving you a little bit of the side eye or something?
Definitely. Yes. It less more so now because I've been doing it. And when I published There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce and it did well, I was like, wow, this means that no other Black girl who writes a book about like Nicki Minaj or whatever, you know what I mean? Like she won't have to deal with that same thing because I did this thing and it was received as you know what I mean? But I
Yeah.
got a lot of questions when that book was coming out, and even with my first book of like, is this poetry? And you know, I got an MFA. Like, you know, like yes, it is.
Yeah.
There's sestinas in that book, you know, there's a lot of formal stuff happening. And one thing I always pointed back to was, you know, one of my white ancestors, Frank O'Hara, who uses pop culture all the time or did. And I don't believe had the same sort of scrutiny. At T.S. Eliot, to go even further back.
Sure.
You know, we read The Wasteland and we need it sort of like dissected because of the cultural references that are no longer relevant. But now we have Google. So, and
Yeah.
I really am not that worried that people aren't going to know who Beyonce, you know what I mean? Like it's really not a concern anymore. And I haven't found, even when folks don't get every reference, I haven't found that they don't understand, you know? It's less about that specificity and more about the fact that specificity is included so that it feels authentic, because these are the brands and names and sounds and soundtracks that we're living with. So it's more of an authentic experience that's being relayed, rather than something that kind of puts pop culture over here and high art over here. And, you know, that's not how I experience the world. And that's not the world that I want to represent in my work because it would feel false. But yeah, it has been you know, I couldn't believe getting questions that are like, is this poetry? I'm like, it says poetry on the back of the book. So it is, you know, and it's not,
Prove yourself, right?
it has line breaks. It has, you know, and obviously if I were talking about, I have a friend who has a series of poems that are all called Chet Baker. That's not Beyonce. You know what I mean? And I think, and he's not a Black woman. So it's hard for me to imagine that at least 50% of the reason I'm getting those questions is because of my identity and the identity of the folks that I'm summoning. If I weren't summoning a rapper, if I were talking about, I don't know, whatever. If I were talking about Billie Holiday or something, then we might be having a different conversation. But I do find that people have this delineation in their mind about what is pop and what is lowbrow and highbrow, I guess,
Yeah.
and never the twain shall meet, you know, and it's disrespectful of poetry or it's disrespectful of blah, 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 and it waters down this. You know, I really don't know because again, my goal in making work is to communicate, right? And to connect. So that's connection. You know, you can connect on someone on the most surface of levels of like, we've both heard the same song. And then it allows for this sort of intimacy with the reader where I'm able to say much more. You know what I mean? I don't just stop at describing pop culture or, you know, bringing it up. There are deeper truths in the poem that, you know, laying that groundwork of familiarity with pop culture allows me to go a little bit deeper in the poem, I think.
Yeah. And I find it so just so engaging and inviting because the idea, like your ideas and what you do, sometimes are surprising and like, basically what they're bringing in for me in my learning. Like,
Mhm.
it sounds strange to say, or maybe it isn't, but like I find myself learning like so much through it just by the way of viewing things in a historical
Mhm.
context. I asked you about art, and usually I follow it up with like, what's the role of art? But I'm going to ask it like towards poetry. You know, it's like 2024 here. You know, poetry always gets a reaction, right?
Yeah.
Like I
Yep.
adore it. You know, there's all these tropes and stuff like that. But 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 poetry is amazing, and we all continue to talk about it. But
It's still
what
here. Yeah.
it's still here. You know, 2024. here we're recording. What do you think the role of poetry is now? I mean, is there anything different about it now, or what is the role?
You know, to tell the truth, I think I'm looking at this. I have two quotes above my desk I'm looking at. One is June Jordan, who says, I'm going to read it right to you. Poetry is a political action undertaken for the sake of information. The faith, the exorcism, and the lyrical invention that telling the truth makes possible. Poetry means taking control of the language of your life. I think about that last piece a lot in terms of there's so much language of my life that I'm not in control of, that I hear, that I'm, so much input that is often really damaging. And the power of poetry to reclaim that, to reframe it often, to look at it differently, to use language that is empowering rather than degrading. That is what it can do and be. Just by fucking with language, like
Yeah,
that's kind of the possibility behind it. Just by changing syntax, you can kind of change the way that you previously saw something, and that is a form of taking control of, because language, the what we say and how we say it is so related to what we're thinking. So if we can infiltrate language, then we can infiltrate thinking in a way, and I think a lot about that exorcism, that invention, that telling the truth makes possible. That's what poetry is. And I think not that the role is different now, but as it was in June Jordan's time, she wrote quite a bit about Palestine, as it was in Nikki Giovanni's time, in, in times of Black Revolution. It has always been a form of telling the truth, and it's always been an urgency against misinformation, and we're seeing that played out politically. So, in just like the zeitgeist right now and the cultural consciousness that everyone has. So maybe not that poetry has a different power, but that its power is particularly important right now, as it has been in on all these other times where misinformation is really at the heart of kind of our fighting with each other.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
it has,
Amazing.
it has the power to kind of like be an antidote to that.
Yeah, there's a power within it for me. It's a couple things like I find when I'm reading poetry, and I'm fascinated by words, just read and read and read. But I mean, love words. But within poetry and its construction, there's like when well executed, there's nothing like it as far as being able to explain, show many things
Hmm.
very quickly.
Hmm.
And I see that, and that's why it can be such a thorough and moving and fulfilling experience. The other piece I was thinking about, like in asking the questions, I've been thinking about this lately, just the philosophy in the background. Philosopher Heidegger with is works on technology, right? And
Hmm.
talking about technology and its threat to humans. And this is about a century ago. And
Hmm.
and I've always found it such a kind of weird twist at the end, and it has to do with truth. And he basically says, particular poets, like they contain the truth, like the heart of it, the entity, the ability to fight back is in poetry. And I
Hmm.
was always like really kind of, thought that was like a weird twist for a philosopher. But I think there's something into it because outsider voice. If poetry is idiosyncratic in the culture, it comes at the culture in a strange way, and that's why I believe in the power of it.
Hmm.
And think that there's something really powerful there. I wanted to ask you about your new collection of essays. You
Hmm.
get what you pay for, and um, so excited to hear the expansion out of ideas and
Hmm.
anecdotes, and just well, I love the poetic language within an
Yeah.
essay as well. So we're not being robbed. No, folks, you're not being
No,
robbed.
not at all. I know. Don't worry.
You're not
It
being
just
robbed
feels
of.
like a really long poetry book to me, honestly. Like now
Okay.
when I read, I'm like, I was using the same muscles, but just in a lot more words, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And really adored that book. You've been, I got some time, with you here and chatting with you, and you've been talking, a lot about the essays. What's been the feedback? Are people kind of wowed or surprised, or they said, "Wow, this is a nice big book of Morgan Parker expanded out a little bit more."
It's been a lot of questions about the differences between poetry and the essay, which is interesting to a point.
Yeah.
But I am a poet, and so did
Yeah.
approach the essays from more of a lyrical place, which I think made the writing process very frustrating, but also made the book closer to what I wanted it to be. And it was a little bit of a challenge just to figure out what my voice sounded like in the
Yeah.
essay form. And it takes a lot of different it takes a lot of different registers. And that's not always what you find in a book of essays. But I do that a lot in my poetry books, and I wanted to do that in the book of essays as well, to kind of like shift registers, have some tongue-in-cheek language and have some sarcastic language, and to shift within even each individual essay. So I did approach it with a lot of the same techniques, repetition and longer metaphors. And I read all the poem or all the sentences out loud, every single one,
Yeah.
multiple times.
Yeah.
So it's really thinking about language, not only precision of language and using the exact right word for what I wanted to get across, but also the right sound to the right word. That's something that poets think about. Not all prose writers are thinking on that same level. They're just thinking maybe on the first precision level. But for me, I know that something happens on a secondary level of what you're talking about. That's like it's rhythm, it's sound, and there is meaning that can be gleaned in that. It's not something you can put your finger on, but it is a way of reinforcing what's been written, reinforcing the words. The rhythm helps with that. So really thinking about how to use that in an essay was hard. It was really hard because, like you said, a poem is trying to do a lot of things in a really short amount of time. And I wanted to do that, but I also am aware of the constraints of the sentence and wanted to be able to, like you said, kind of stretch out with a lot of these ideas. But parts of that was frustrating because they were a lot of the same ideas that I've talked about in my poetry books. And I had already done so succinctly. So
Yeah.
it was kind of like, all right,
Oh, yeah.
how do I step this out and connect all these dots that for me, they're also already right there. So that process was interesting, but it was a fun one because I do think it was a new way of stretching my poetic voice rather than a distraction from it. I really do think that it helps to hone in on that attention to language and rhythm without the aid of line breaks or with that, having to do that within the constraints of prose, I think was a really cool challenge in the end. Um, but it has been, it's been a different reception than my other books. I think this one will take some time for folks to read. It took many years for me to write. And there's just a lot going on in it. So I think there's a lot more conversations to be had around it rather than reaction. Um, so which is different than with the poetry books. People are consuming it. They're like really getting the punch of everything right away. Whereas with this one, I think it will be a thing where people are taking their time, have to think about it. Maybe it works on them in a little of a slower way. But it has been cool to see the interest in poets writing essays and the interest and trust really in folks like really wanting to know what I have to say on these different topics, not just in an entertaining poem way, so that has been, just a really interesting and a cool way to interact with old readers and new ones also,
Yeah, hell yeah. There was a really poignant part. I mean, there's different essays I could talk about, but just in talking about the Williams sisters and talking about Venus Williams, and it was this idea that you really distilled of the pressure, the absolute pressure, to do things the right way in front of white eyes and in culture, to not be that upset, to not manifest too much blackness on the tennis court. And the way you conveyed that was really powerful, because it 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 needs to be described, like the psychological experience, but also through that, when how does somebody become a hero or become a queen in that sense? And you build on that is, I have lived, I have done this, I have done it my way, and I made it through. But the pressure of the outside, not only of performance, but I'm waiting you to fuck up, black person. I'm waiting you to fuck up, or like yell at the line judge, and look at that black woman yelling at the line judge. I tell you, that really brought it home for me, because it's a whole dynamic that you're talking about that she has to work and live for. And it's tennis, of course. I mean, not even to get into that whole background.
Right, not even to get into the historical implications of that and what is threatened by just her body being on the court,
Yeah.
That's the thing. It's like she can't just show up and have a challenging game. She has to have the additional challenge of being, a symbol of something, and that pressure is on all of us. I think it's useful to look at these bigger names and these bigger personalities and see it, but then to apply it to the everyday Black person. Like, we're all dealing with this on our levels, on our scales, maybe it's not a national stage, but there are ways that we're battling, first of all, not only internal pressure, someone like Serena Williams is probably so hard on herself, you know what I mean? Like, there's that, when you're ambitious, that internal pressure to achieve. And then you've got this outside pressure that is, on one hand, encouraging you and wanting you to be this symbol for a whole group of people. And then this other group that's putting pressure on you to fail, because it's expected and because it follows some kind of storyline that we're used to. And I think, that's what's great about her. And that's what's great about Black celebrities that have held on to themselves in a way, because we know that they've had to battle so many small and large pressure chambers, and it is unfair, but it's something that comes with the territory. And I think, like you said, it's worth talking about, because I think it's easy for us to think, well, her only job is to show up and, win the tennis game. But that's not even close,
Yeah. I mean, I thought that that was just really so powerful to think about. And it's a dog-friendly podcast. So you didn't hear from
Shirley. I don't even know what she's looking at.
Morgan, what's the name of the dog? The dog is a guest now.
Shirley.
Shirley's on this episode too. I just didn't announce that. That's why it was an intrusion. But no. Thank you so much for that. I think in the book, I thought about a lot of Black stand-up comics that I've listened to over time. And then in going through your work, it made me think a little bit more towards not just stand-up comedy and the ins and the ats and what philosophy that there is in there, but also within poetry and the word, and to speak to what is the case. And thank you so much for your essays, everybody. You get what you pay for. It's the new essay collection by Morgan Parker. I got a couple quick things for you. Well, actually, one's not super quick, but big question in the show is, why is there something rather than nothing? But I also ask it another way for creators, if you so choose, is when you create, are you creating something from nothing?
I think so. I mean, not from nothing, right? I guess, because it's all from stuff.
Yeah,
it's all the stuff of past, of my life, of my internal shit. But that's one reason I like being an artist, because I like the idea that I can make something that wasn't there before. That is awesome to me. I can't, you know what I mean? I can't make music. I can't, but I like the idea that I can invent something, even if it's just language, even if it's just a sentence. The page was blank, now it's not. That is its own magic. So it's not from nothing, but it is putting something in place that wasn't there before, which I think is really special.
Yeah. I want to ask you one weird question. Was Bill Cosby ever America's dad, in your opinion?
I mean, Bill Cosby on the show, yes.
Yeah, I thought he was too. I thought he was everybody's dad. That was a cultural piece.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, that was a different time. I felt that.
Really was. It really was. Yeah.
That was pretty wild. You get into the Cosby stuff in the book, and approach it in such a way that I highly suggest everybody read Morgan Parker. I would say that anyways. Morgan Parker, you are my favorite poet. I think you are just a phenomenal writer. I have learned so much from you. And I just want you to know authentically, it is a true thrill for me to have you on this show.
Thank you so much. That means the world.
Yeah, we've never met, but you mean a lot to me. And then also the opening up of poetry at this point in my life. I'm a little bit over 50 now, but I was talking about the teens and getting into poetry. Poetry's always been around for me, but it's done something magical for me now, and is a really good way for me to get at things, which I kind of forgot about, right? We all forget about that.
Right.
Like, I wrote poetry when I was 17 and I stuck it in a drawer, but really the power still remains.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Finally, where do folks go? You can go to the bookstore, everybody, and get these titles.
Any bookstore, yes.
Any bookstore.
You can get it on bookshop.org.
Bookshop.
And that proceeds there go to your favorite indie bookstores. And you can find me on Instagram, Morgan Apple Zero.
Yeah.
That's pretty much it. I haven't been on Twitter since I got a new name. So
all right. I wanted to say one thing about there are more beautiful things than Beyonce. When I love a book so much and it's like one I want to hold on to, and I'm like, I'm not going to give it away because I'm a collector, which is a form of obsession.
Yeah, I see computer typewriters here. So yeah, there are many more.
But I had this, there's some books that I'm like, okay, for the betterment of somebody being able to find this on a used bookshelf, just like I would want to find it on a used bookshelf, I'm going to bring it over to Powell's and put it there. So I did, but it was for the collective, and it override my individual need to have that right next to me. I haven't given up others of your books yet. So
I feel like that one is one that people are always like, well, someone stole my copy. So I went to someone and they didn't give it back. So.
No, I was tearing up as I brought it into Powell's. The rest of the world, you need this, so it's in somebody else's hand. Everybody, Morgan Parker, great pleasure to talk to you. Great luck and fortune in all the work that you do. and really appreciate your time. And best of luck with the tours, the interviews, everything you want to do.
Thank you. Appreciate you.
Take care, Morgan.
Have a good one.
You too.
This is Something Rather Than Nothing.
And listeners, to stay connected with us and our guests, visit somethingratherthannothing.com. Join our mailing list for exclusive updates and access to guest-created art. If you enjoyed this episode or any episode, please like, subscribe, and leave a review on your podcast platform. People really read that shit. Your support helps us reach more listeners and spread our community across the planet. This is a global show, and we like to give a shout out to our many listeners across the world, including many listeners in Canada, Spain, Germany, UK, Argentina, Brazil, India, Thailand, and so many more places. Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast for behind-the-scenes content. And the best way to help the show is to tell your friends about us. If you love it, they'll love it too. Tell your friends who love it. We love you. This is Something Rather Than Nothing Podcast.